Welcome to episode 44 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Last week, to close out 2019, I had PJ Caposey on as my guest. My conversation with PJ actually began back in October. I had invited him on to talk about one of his latest books. His response to me was, "I'd love to talk about time management with you, but you've got to talk to Julie Adams about the book I co-authored with her titled #Fully Charged." He followed up about 20 minutes later with an email connecting Julie and I. Now, have you heard the phrase Maslow before Bloom? Fully Charged is the definitive guide on how to tend to your Maslow and cultivate your Bloom. Here's the deal. I had heard this phrase many times, but never looked deep into how impactful this is. I also used Fully Charged to help guide a half-day in-service with my staff. I did so because Fully Charged looks beyond Maslow and Bloom of students. It also goes in depth to discussing how we must tend to Maslow and Bloom of our parents and our teachers. I have strategically planned this episode to be the Anchored in Education kickoff to 2020. And since Fully Charged is so robust, we are going to be covering part 1 this week and part 2 next Monday. It is well worth your time to listen to what Julie has to say. I promise that Fully Charged has the ability to change your life, your teaching, and your outlook. Julie, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott. I'm excited to be here.
I don't know that your excitement can match my excitement, but we'll see, because I've been looking forward to this one for quite some time. And we're going to jump into Fully Charged. But first, before we get started, I'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Well, a couple of things happened. My mom, who is one of my biggest supporters, and I just adore her for it, she said that I was born to be a teacher. And even when I was 2 or 3 years old, I would put my couple dolls together and my stuffed animals, and I would teach them something. And she said that she noticed how interested I was in that, even though I had never really been in a formal setting before. I was not in a preschool. I wasn't in any type of a daycare program, but I was just naturally setting up a teaching opportunity for my little stuffed animals and my dolls. And so she said that it was something that was just innate to me, and she marveled at it. Another thing that I found was so powerful was I had the opportunity to be connected to a couple really impactful teachers in my own education. So my first grade teacher, Miss Donenworth, my 10th grade teacher, um, just wonderful, amazing, fantastic, influential, positive teachers. My Spanish teacher, Senior Mello. I mean, just all of them really fantastic. My 10th grade teacher, I'm sorry, I did not mention her, Mrs. Van Diest. So
Okay.
Miss Donenworth, Mrs. Van Diest, Senior Mello, they were just so influential in my life. And I thought, wow, if I could have the opportunity just to positively impact others in that way, that would be such an honor. And then finally, once I became a teacher, a quick interaction with one of my students completely blew my mind.
Uh-huh.
So I was teaching English and history and reading to middle school. And I taught middle school for 10 years. And one day I was teaching an 8th grade history lesson. And one of my struggling students, who I call Brian, he made the comment, hey, Mrs. Adams, this is hard. I don't get it. And I flippantly told him, Brian, just try a little bit harder. Read these primary source documents one more time, and it will probably click and make perfect sense. And that's when he turned to me with brutal honesty and said, "Mrs. Adams, nobody wakes up to suck. I know that all of you teachers think I like to fail my classes and fight with everybody, but I don't. So if you could please help me be successful, I would appreciate it." And that quick interaction rocked my world because, one, as a new teacher, I did not have the knowledge and skills to help him socially, emotionally, and academically.
Yeah.
And two, he so clearly clarified for me what great educators and mentors and parents and leaders do. And that is help people to be successful.
Wow. And
And so that set me out on a journey, yeah, to learn everything I could to come back
yeah.
and try and help others.
What an amazing eye-opening experience you had as a teacher with that student, and
Right.
who knew that his candidness would set you on a path that kind of I would say transforms your history of anchored in
That's right.
education.
That's right, because he nailed the $1,000,000 question, right? And that is, if I don't have what it takes to be successful, can I develop it? And who can help me? And that so clearly clarifies what our role is as mentors and educators and leaders. And just to keep in mind, nobody wakes up to suck,
Yeah,
right? And
that's
so
right.
if somebody is struggling, there's a reason.
Sure.
And that's really the foundation of Fully Charged.
So let's get into fully charged, and let's begin talking about the title fully charged, because we often say in our high moments that we are charged up, or when we're exhausted, we can often be found saying, "Well, we're running on empty." But what we may not realize is how accurate this truly is when
Right,
coming to
right.
our cognitive capacity. So let's begin by talking about our internal battery and the value of making sure it is fully charged each day.
Right, absolutely. Well, contrary to popular belief, it is a myth that we have unlimited critical thinking and creative capacity each day. We have finite amounts. And what science shows is that every morning we wake up with a rechargeable battery, our brain. Some of us are waking up fully charged, some of us are waking up drained. And the problem is that our brain and our body keep score. And so it's okay for us to wake up drained for short periods of time, during those busy hustle phases of life where maybe we're working more, or we have more classes that we're taking,
Yeah.
or we're trying to go to the next level in our career. But those hustle phases where we're waking up drained, they have to be followed by long periods of recovery. Because if we wake up drained more days than not, then what happens is we trigger negative chemical reactions that cause disease, and of course disease causes inflammation and death. And so it's a scientific look at the logistics of what it is that we're dealing with. And many of us are waking up more drained
Yeah.
than we want to be. And how do we know that? Because studies show stress, anxiety, and depression are the three most diagnosed mental health issues now around the world. And they are the number one reason why people are now going out on permanent disability. And so we're not just talking about this from a student perspective, how important it is for them to wake up fully charged, but we're talking about this just as a universal issue that all of us are dealing with. And if we're not careful, it's going to have a serious impact. Not only on our family structures and our health and wellness, but also on our economy. If
Yeah.
all of our employees are going out on permanent disability, I mean, we're in major trouble.
Yeah. Devastating is what it would be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, um, getting our basic mental, physical health needs met, that's what triggers the positive chemical reactions that help us to wake up fully charged every day.
Okay, so for a while now, we have heard people talk about Maslow before Bloom.
Right.
And, I think that traditional teacher prep programs, they so thoughtfully focus on Bloom much more than Maslow.
Hmm.
And so naturally, we're entering education, we're ready to promote Bloom, but we're not addressing true needs. And so that's essentially that is what you're talking about when we're talking about making sure our battery is fully charged. So can we take some time to discuss how force feeding Bloom while neglecting Maslow needs sets everyone up for failure?
Absolutely. And I learned this as a remedial reading teacher. And so for a couple of years, I was working with so many students who struggled academically. And of course, the first thing we do when students struggle academically is we assess and then we try to remediate. We try to provide more academics to fill in those gaps. But what's important to understand is critical thinking, literacy, and numeracy, those skills require battery charge
Yeah.
because we have limited cognitive capacity every day. And so, if we are drained, we don't have enough battery charge to devote to critical thinking and skills development because we're really in survival mode. We're looking for just our basic needs to be met. So, if we understand the neuroscience behind what helps us to operate, we need battery charge in order to develop skills. And so when we try to force feed skills development to somebody who's drained, we're wasting our time and resources many times because very few people can develop skills when they are hungry or fatigued or they feel unsafe or disconnected. And so that's why Maslow is so powerful because when we meet those basic Maslow needs, that's what triggers the positive chemical reactions that charges up our battery. Once we have enough battery charge, then we can learn and perform with literacy and numeracy and creativity and critical thinking.
Yeah, and that's something that I want to take just a time out to talk about that. I mean, we'll get to the Bloom, but
Yeah.
as you talk about the Maslow needs of students, that what we don't take into consideration is when you talk about a finite charge in our battery every day. When our students get up and they don't know if they're going to have or where they can find clean clothes or
Yeah.
breakfast or even transportation, that already we're tapping into whatever charge they have on their battery for the day. And we don't know what happened from the time they went to bed, when they went to bed, to the time they got up or when they got up. And so they could already be half capacity before they even get to us.
Right. Absolutely. And so when we try to force feed blooms on top of that, we're draining them more. Ultimately, is what we're doing many times. And so when when I had students who had been in remediation for years with no improvement, that's when it started to just really dig under my skin. What is going on here? We have the greatest curriculum, all of these wonderful supports, all of this extra time for the child to develop the skills, and yet for some reason they can't. And but then I started to notice that those remedial teachers who were really focused on providing snacks, providing a safe, inviting environment, purposely developing positive relationships with kids, checking in on them. That's when I started to notice, wow, you know what? The strategies that they're using for remediation seem to stick.
Hmm.
Um, and at the beginning, I was giving the strategies too much power and respect, if you will,
Right.
you know? And I wasn't looking at the picture globally. But once I started to notice, okay, there's a whole system of support that's going on there that's rooted in Maslow and skills development, Bloom development, and that's when it seems to be working. And then I started to implement it into my own instructional practices. That's when I started to see great gains. And kids who had struggled for years were starting to come to my classes saying, you're the only reason I'm here today. Or
Oh,
your classes are the ones that I look forward to. Or Mrs. Adams, what do you mean you're not going to be here tomorrow? There's going to be a substitute. I'm not even going to bother coming, if you're not here. And that's when it really started to become very apparent to me. One, nobody wakes up to suck.
right.
So if we provide extra remedial support and it's not working, there is a reason. And so we should grow curious instead of growing furious, right? And a lot of times, once we understand the basic neuroscientific principles, you got to have battery charge in order to develop skills and in order to perform with those skills, then it makes sense.
Oh,
And we can
yeah.
be much more efficient in how we're using our time and energy and also how we're supporting these kids.
Wow. Well, and okay, so far in this episode, we have talked about meeting the needs of students. But, at least to me, personal opinion here, quite possibly one of the coolest aspects of this book is that you and your co authors take the time to address cultivating the Maslow needs of parents and teachers. And I mean, like I said, we've talked about students, and we could go on. We could make an episode just out of meeting the needs of students
Right.
and the positive benefits. But I mean, is it safe to say that too often we make the error of assuming adults are capable of making sure their own needs are met?
Absolutely. I learned this principle from my husband. My husband recently retired as a school superintendent. So he was a teacher and an assistant principal, an associate superintendent, and a superintendent of schools for years. And he would always say, um, think about the Richard Branson, the head of Virgin Airlines, that quote, train and support your people so well that everybody wants to steal them, but treat them so well that they never want to leave.
Yes.
And I think a mistake that sometimes we make is that we forget that parenting and teaching, those are skills. And we have to intentionally develop those skills, right? And so we don't want to assume that somebody has those skills if they don't. And we also don't want to assume that their basic needs are being met, because I don't know about you, being a teacher and being a parent, those are two examples where your battery will be drained,
And quickly.
right? And so when we when we don't give the respect to the seriousness of the situation, the constant drain on our own capacity, I think that we're not being thoughtful about what it really takes to be successful. And so we don't want to assume that somebody has skills, because parenting and teaching skills are not necessarily innate.
Okay.
And I don't know about you. I thought I knew everything about parenting until I became a parent.
Yeah, and then I found out I knew nothing.
Right? And so we want to be respectful and let parents know, hey, there's a lot of research coming out, a lot of strategies, just like we do with teachers. How much time do we spend training and supporting teachers? Well, we should also be thinking universally, a systems wide approach in terms of how can we make our educational system more effective. Well, the chemical reactions that are triggered in our students that influence their social, emotional, and academic success are triggered in the home hours before they get to us.
Yep.
And so it only makes sense then that we take a system wide approach and strengthen the students, the families, and the staff, and make sure everybody's aware of this research and the strategies, and we build the relationships and the support system. So we remove the stigma of struggle, and we vocalize to people, hey, parenting is a tough gig, teaching is a tough gig,
Yeah.
and we need to work together to support each other.
And I should have probably mentioned this towards the beginning, but this book is rooted in research. This isn't something
Right.
that you're just pulling out of a hat.
Right.
What you're talking about in here is backed by research.
Right. Because my student Brian, who said, hey, Mrs. Adams, can you help me be successful? Well, when I started studying the research about success, what does it take to grow healthy brains and maintain healthy brains? What does it take to be successful? How do we increase literacy and numeracy and critical thinking and performance and efficiency? Success really boils down to two ideas: sex, which is social emotional ecstasy,
Uh
and
huh.
I know it sounds strange, and skills,
Yeah.
because success is rooted in chemical reactions. So if we can trigger positive chemical reactions, um, that help to charge up the brain. That's called social emotional ecstasy.
Yeah.
And how do we get it? By meeting basic Maslow needs. And then once we have that battery charge, those positive chemical reactions, then we can teach the skill that we need to be successful, whether it's literacy skill or basketball skills or public speaking skills or even conflict management skills.
Oh,
And so
absolutely.
once we understand that success is rooted in chemical reactions determine our battery charge. And we have to intentionally go after social emotional ecstasy, which is getting those chemicals appropriately balanced by meeting those basic needs. And then we also have to intentionally develop the skills that we need to be successful. So, social emotional ecstasy and skills are the foundation to success. And it's rooted in research. It's fascinating stuff.
And of course, I'm going to have a link to the book Fully Charged on my
Thank you.
website. But if they pick that up, there is more information on the social emotional ecstasy that really kind of lays it out and explains it quite well, and will get the reader thinking. So, Julie, a minute ago, I used a word, and then you used it. I counted at least twice, but it's a word we hear a lot, and the word is assume. And
Mhm.
so I'm going to put it out there that this was probably the best word for me to come out of Fully Charged, and that is assumicide.
Yeah,
So educators, myself included, are guilty of this. So can we
right.
explain assumicide for our listeners?
Right. I've heard the term used several times, but probably one of the ways that it was used and it really stuck in my mind is from educator Kelly Gallagher. He is a literacy and a reading writing expert. He teaches English in Southern California, and he wrote a book called Readicide. And
Okay.
but he talks about the danger of us assuming that people have skills or that certain things are being done, and then blaming people when they're not. Okay, so for example, in our book Fully Charged, we talk about the danger of committing a suicide and thinking that a child should have a skill because he's of a certain age. And what research shows is that brain maturation rates differ, and skills don't develop as the result of age, but they develop as the result of experience and instruction and reflection on that experience. So let me give you an example. Let's say that there are twins who are born, and you take one twin and you lock him up in a dark closet, and that's where he's going to be raised for 25 years. He's going to be isolated, alone, very few experiences. And then you take the other twin and you raise him in a thriving, healthy Maslow and Bloom's needs meeting environment. And if you compare their brain scans, let's say you do an MRI or a PET scan, when they're 10 years old, 20 years old, you'll notice that their brains, of course, are exactly the same age, but their brains will look different and they will have different skills developed as the result of the experiences and the instruction that they've had. And so as a new teacher, I remember saying so many times to kids, you should know how to organize your math binder. You're 15 years old, for goodness sakes, right? Or
Right.
you should know how to summarize because we ask you to summarize all the time. And again, it goes back to that idea of you can have a class full of 35, 15-year-olds who are all at different skill levels because they've all had very different experiences and very different levels of instruction and reflection on that instruction.
Yeah.
And so a suicide is dangerous when we apply it to students or to families or to even our staff, right? Even the audacity of assuming
Yes.
that a teacher knows how to teach content in a way that learning sticks. That's a big assumption now, because teaching credential programs are diverse and all of them are so uh, produce different levels of competency, if you will. But then there's also onus on the learner for what am I reflecting on in terms of my learning and how am I intentionally growing my skills?
Yeah. And like I said, this was one of the best words I pulled out because it has challenged my thinking since I've read the book that
Mhm.
now when either I say or I hear someone say, you should know how to do this. You should, you're X amount of years old. This is something that my next follow up is, how do I know that? How
Right.
how do I know? And the thing is, I've read this, and since then I have said to my own kids, you should know
Right.
better. And then I have to think like, wait a second, do they know
Hmm.
better? And and there
Right.
are times flat out that yes, they have been taught, they have had the practice. This was negligence. They
Right.
know
Right.
where their stuff goes at the end of the night. But there are other times that they have done stuff when I say you should know better, and then I think, wait a second, have I, as your dad, taught you this, or has your
Right.
mother? And the answer sometimes is no. And so that is our own children. That's my own children. So now put that in a school of 500 kids or more,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that come from all these different experiences, like you're talking about,
Right.
and all of a sudden, the words "you should know better" take on a whole other meaning, and
Right.
and it's from a suicide.
Right. And then think about, sometimes we have the skill, but because our battery is so drained, we can't perform the skill. We can't demonstrate the skill. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind also is, do you have enough battery charge to even demonstrate that skill right now? And if not, what's missing? Do you need a little bit more rest? Do you need a meal? Do you need to have a couple positive connections with some people because you just feel like you've just been criticized or attacked so much recently? And so sometimes we do have the skill, but we can't even demonstrate it because we're so drained.
Yeah, and here's another one that I'll put out there for our listeners today, because you talk about like it could it be something as simple as, do they need a snack? Are they hungry? And so
Right.
I taught first grade, and I'm sure that I was guilty of this. Whenever somebody said something, I'm just hungry, and my initial reaction is, well, you just came from lunch.
Hmm.
You shouldn't be. But then think about this, step back, and let's, the times I was fortunate enough that on every third week I got to do lunchroom duty.
Mm.
And and I say fortunate enough, I
Right.
but
Right.
but I get to see what some of these students are bringing, or lack thereof, in their lunch, or what they're eating or choosing to eat, and come to find out that sometimes through things that are in their control or out of their control, are leading them to their needs are not being met, and we need to take the extra step, and it could be some crackers or something. This isn't hard stuff, but
Right.
it's not hard to take action. It's just hard to bring ourselves and our mindset into that we need to be looking at the whole picture of the child.
That's right. Absolutely.
Okay, so throughout the book, it was mentioned that parents are sending the best they have, and that parents are truly doing the best they can at that exact moment. And so while our interactions with parents, it may not always be positive, we must take into account that they may be stressed.
Mhm.
And stress, as we find out, is a big time battery drainer, leading to less compassion and empathy. So, how can we be better at supporting parents?
Well, that's a great question, and something that I have learned working with international schools. So I have I usually do one or two international trips a year working with international schools and providing training to families from a variety of different cultures. And one thing that has become so apparent to me is, regardless of the culture, regardless of the socioeconomic status, regardless of the language that you speak, every parent wants their children to be happier, healthier, and more successful than they have been.
Yes.
Every single one, right? It's an innate desire, I think, as a parent, for us to see our offspring thrive, not just survive, but thrive. And so it's important to understand, again, nobody wakes up to suck. And so
No.
whether it's a 5-year-old or a 45-year-old, when we're struggling, when we can just, one, raise their level of awareness to, hey, here's some of the latest research. Here are a couple strategies that are recommended. Here are some ways that we can support you in that. And we are here because we want to partner with you. And we also want your children to be happy and healthy and thriving. I think that's when we can communicate to parents that we've got your back and you're not in this alone,
Yep.
and that's when we can help them to recognize the stressors that they're under and how that influences the decisions that they make, and remove the stigma around it. Parenting is tough. There's no way to get around it.
Very, very tough.
Right? Absolutely. And some people say it's a walk in the park, and then there's that joke. Yeah, it's like a walk in Jurassic Park, right? When you have children in your home, it's like being ruled by, tyrants,
Yeah.
little little tyrants who don't have, just their basic emotional controls.
Yeah.
And as a result, it tends to drain us and stress us.
That's right. All right, Julie, before we go, we have to take a minute to talk about the staff and their needs.
Right.
Specifically, let's spend a minute talking about secondary traumatic stress.
Yeah.
Quite possibly, we have only thought of this as something experienced by first responders or nurses, but research has now indicated that teachers suffer from it as well. I'm hoping maybe you can take a minute to explain this for our listeners and what we can do to help empower our staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, in education tends to glorify martyrdom. And so we tend to communicate that you're only a great teacher if you are at the school site from sun up to past sundown, or you are exhausted, or you are in charge of the 55 activities that we have asked you to be charge of. And so I remember one of my first administrators coming to me saying, hey, we need you to coach this and this. I need you to take over as athletic or activities director. And also, would you mind being in charge of the yearbook
Yeah,
this year? You're a newer teacher, you have more energy, the kids seem to like to be around you. And these are some things that we're looking at, you know, before we offer you a guaranteed position, right? Or
right.
tenuring,
Yeah,
basically. So basically, I was almost being threatened, if you will, you got to do these 55 things on top of your full teaching load.
yeah,
But at that time, we had such a huge amount of people entering our profession that we could almost do that
right.
and threaten, well, and if you don't, we have 500 people lined up behind you who want your job.
Oh, sure.
But see, now we don't have that. Now we're in the greatest teacher shortage this country has ever seen, and it's expected to continue for the next decade, and that's a major problem. And so, one, we want to do away with the idea of glorifying martyrdom. We don't have to sacrifice our own mental, physical health and wellness for the sake of others. They can be in tandem together. We can take care of ourselves so that we can even more effectively continue to care for others. Another idea is, I really think educators are the first responders in most situations,
Sure.
because we become aware of situations as we're working with kids and families a lot faster than many other people in society do, right?
Uh
And
huh.
so a couple of ways that we can support and empower our staff is to, one, raise the level of awareness about our own battery charge, right? Getting into the habit of, how charged up are you today and why? what are some simple adjustments you need to make. We can also do that by assessing our Maslow needs. That's why we created the youth and the adult Maslow assessments and included those in the back of the book
Yep.
so that we're more aware of those needs. We want to, again, remove the stigma around mental, physical health and wellness, but we also want to model and encourage self care and family and personal time. So when a leader stands up and says it's important for you to practice self care and have personal time, but that leader is not practicing self-care
Right.
and they're, sending emails and requests at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. It's one thing to say it, but to actually model it and encourage it and support it is another thing. And so we kind of have to take a step back and reassess, what are we communicating? What are we supporting? And we want to make sure that we are not draining our staff because they are our greatest resource in our
Yes.
system, period, hands down. Sometimes they can be a great stressor. It's true. Anytime we're dealing with people, regardless of the role that they're in, they can be a great stressor and a drainer. But ultimately, our teachers are our greatest resource. And so we have got to care for them mentally and physically, and then also cognitively and professionally. And it's all about, social emotional ecstasy and then skills development and support.
Yes, and I just want to you hit on this, but I just want to reiterate that we cannot feel guilty taking time for ourselves.
That's right.
And that may be, if you are one of those educators who have a family, that means that time for yourself may be time that you're giving, all of you to your family, or it may mean just you, an activity, you and you alone. But we can't feel guilty about that because that's truly what we need.
Absolutely. In fact, it will increase our efficiency and productivity professionally when we guard our personal time and we make sure that those basic needs are met and we have interests outside of our profession.
Absolutely. Now, this kind of wraps up our episode for today. And I know that I have listeners that are thinking, hold on a second. You said we would be talking about some Bloom strategies, and all we talked about are Maslow. But you are going to be joining us next week, and
Yes,
we're going to be talking about Fully Charged, and we're going to be talking about those Bloom strategies.
absolutely.
All right. Well,
Absolutely.
I am looking forward to it for this week. Julie, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Now, you can find Julie on Twitter by searching at Adams Teaching. Now, you can also read more about Julie as well as find a link to hashtag Fully Charged on my website, escottengland.com. I'm also going to link up to Julie's website, adamsteaching.com. And before I wrap up today's episode, I'm going to remind you, first time in 2020, but far from the last, don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Now, remember at the beginning of this episode, I talked about how I incorporated what I learned from Fully Charged into a half-day in-service with my staff? Now, let me talk about that for a minute. I spent a good portion of the time talking about how we needed to tend to the needs of our students. Students have a variety of needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we must recognize that while basic needs should be taken care of before they get to us in schools, they often are not. We go right into teaching a lesson, and I am guessing it is beyond a stellar lesson, but it is all lost on a student who is incapable of blooming because basic needs have not been met. But there was a second part of my in-service, and it was the recognition that we sometimes give so much of ourselves that we neglect what should be basic needs for us. So I sent my staff off to lunch with a task. I told them to go to lunch with a friend and enjoy a conversation that wasn't centered around work. And then when they were done, I asked them not to return to their classrooms, but instead, I told them to go do something for themselves that would allow them to meet needs that have been neglected. Not to go home and do dishes or vacuum. It could be taking that neglected walk, reading a book, or just listening to their favorite music, allowing themselves to get lost in the sounds. I did not ask for staff to report back on how they met their needs, only that they did something for them. All afternoon, though, I received texts and emails just telling me how much they appreciated and what they did. And they didn't have to do this, but I tell you, it had a warming effect on me as well. The time, I could tell, was truly appreciated. I even took two of my favorite people to lunch that day, Easton and Sage. Now, we owe it to ourselves to give it all we have to our students because we are often all they have to begin with. But we must tend to our needs too. Listen to what your mind and your body is saying. Find an accountability partner if you have to, because we cannot bloom if we have neglected our Maslow. Doing so will help us at the end of the day remain anchored in education.